Man came up to Jesus one day and asked him, what is the greatest commandment? Right? Like, out of all these 10, or all 613 for that matter, which one would you want to know? Right? I mean, maybe we can fail at 612, but nail the most important one and end up pleasing God after all. Having never paid that much attention to the others, but if we knew which one was the greatest, we could pay attention to that, right? So which one? Which one, Jesus? Which is it? And here's what Jesus said to him. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. Now, if you've read through the Ten Commandments as they're listed in Exodus or in Deuteronomy, they're in both. Or even as you see them posted somewhere or other, like sometimes they have 10 Commandments at a school or at a courthouse or something like that. Or if you see it on the wall of somebody's house, you remember or if you remember the 10 Commandments at all, you might think to yourself, where is Jesus getting that? His first and great commandment, where is he getting that? According to Jesus, the first and greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. But this commandment is not one of the 10 Commandments. Do you notice that? It's not one of the 10 Commandments, not the way we list them anyways. And then Jesus goes on to tell the man that the second most great, there's actually two. There's two great commandments, and the second one, the second most greatest commandment is like it. It's like the first one, and it goes like this. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus says, it all comes down to these two. It all comes down to these two. Now, wait a second. What about the 10? What about the 10? Haven't we been saying that out of the 613 laws in the holy law of God, the 10 commandments is the great overarching summary of them all? That if you could keep these 10, if you could just keep these 10, you'll have actually kept all of the 613. And now Jesus is telling us that there's just two? Jesus isn't just coming up with this off the top of his head. These are two of the 613 laws from God's holy law. They just aren't specified in the 10 Commandments this way. The first and greatest commandment is actually given to the people of Israel later, after the law had been instituted for quite some time. And Moses pronounces this law as God's people were finally about to enter the promised land. They'd just been wandering in the desert for 40 years. And now it's time to come back into the promised land, and Moses recounted for them the journey that they had been on as a people, starting with the command to enter the promised land in the first place, which they refused to do, and then he recounted the giving of God's law on Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. And you can find all of this in the book of Deuteronomy, and there in the first few chapters you see Moses recite the 10 Commandments for God's people once again, and then sum up the 10 Commandments with this first and greatest commandment as quoted by Jesus himself. So it's not like it's a commandment that's separate from the 10, right? But rather, it's a commandment that is the very essence of the 10. It's interesting, isn't it, how God keeps on breaking this down for us so that we can really know what it is that's at the center of what he wants for us, right? Now, imagine you're this guy talking with Jesus, and you're thinking that just one great commandment will make this so much easier to keep. That if one great commandment makes it so easy, then maybe, just maybe, I'll make it into heaven after all. And maybe you're not even all that disappointed that Jesus says there's two. You asked for one. Awesome. Just two instead of 10. It's impossible to keep 613. And as we've seen, anytime we examine our own lives in relation to this law of God, it's pretty much impossible, we can see, to keep even the 10. But two? That's way better. What good news for us. That's great news. But then to hear what they are. Love God with all your affections. Love God with all your thoughts. And love God with your very being, your life, who you are, and all you think about, all you desire, centered 100% on God and only God, with genuine, heartfelt passion and desire for God. Wow, that's number one. And whatever you do for yourself, any good or any blessing that you'd seek for yourself, do it. And out of love for others, seek it for them too, just as you do for you. That's number two. Philippians 2, 4 through 5, the Apostle Paul puts it this way. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. You have to concern yourself with your own interests, right? But let each one of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Wow, isn't that a good idea? Right? What a way to make friends, right? Now, maybe you've heard this. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. In other words, treat others the way you want to be treated. What a great idea, right? That's a great idea for making friends. Guys, it's a commandment from the holy law of God. Again, it's not one of the 10. But also, again, Jesus is not just coming up with this right then and there. It's in there. It's in the holy law of God. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Now, listen to Leviticus 19, 9 through 18. And as we go through this passage, listen for do unto others as you'd have them do unto you throughout this passage. Ready? When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. Why not? I mean, why wouldn't you do that? That's just good farming, right? And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. You shall not steal. You shall not deal falsely. You shall not lie to one another. You shall not swear by my name falsely and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall do no injustice in court. It's sometimes tempting to do that. You can win if you just kind of twist the truth a little bit. You might win the case. No, you shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not stand up against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. It's not just a great way to win friends and influence people, to love your neighbor as yourself. It's not just a great way to win friends and influence people, it's a commandment. It's a commandment in the holy law of God. And according to Jesus Christ himself, it's second only to loving God completely. Love your neighbor as yourself. Oh, good, you might think. Along with that guy who came to Jesus, you might think, great, not 10? That's awesome. Just 2? Surely there must be just a few I can actually do. Well, can you keep these 2? Think about it. Love God with all your heart. God, central to every motive. God, the object of every desire. God, the reason for every decision. How's that going? What about this one? Love your neighbor just as much as you love yourself. Love your neighbor in every way that you love yourself. Never falter, never withhold, never exclude others from anything you seek for yourself. How's that going? So I was going to count down from number 10 in the 10 Commandments all the way down to number 1 over the course of this series, and that is still my aim. And we began with, you shall not covet, 10 Commandment number 10. And now we're talking about 2 commandments here that are totally outside the 10 Commandments altogether. Altogether, seemingly totally outside the context of this series, perhaps. Or not. Now, last week, like I just said, I began with, you shall not covet. And I wanted us to see for ourselves all that God has done for us in revealing himself to us. And in giving us a way to know him and come to him through keeping the law that he gave us to keep. And offer to come back to God, though we've fallen, though we've sinned, though we've wandered away from him. What incredible mercy this is. What incredible mercy. He's given us a way to walk. He's led us in the way to walk. The Lord is my shepherd. What more could we want? And already here I'm deep into my point for tonight, even by reminding us of that. How it's completely appropriate, guys, to attach the first and greatest commandment, love the Lord your God, and attach this to the 10th commandment, don't covet. After all God's done for you, After passing over sin and making a way for you by offering relationship with him and identity with him, he's given us everything. He's given us an eternal weight of glory to covet anything other than God. And what he's given is to violate the greatest commandment according to Jesus, and it violates it big time. Now let's continue, and as I begin to close for this evening, perhaps you'll come to see upon reading the commandment again that it's completely appropriate to also attach love your neighbor as yourself to this 10th commandment, don't covet. We're going to attach this one too, love your neighbor as yourself, to the 10th commandment, don't covet. Hear the word of the Lord in his law. This is Exodus 22 and also verse 17. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. You know that God could have said, don't covet houses, right? Like, if I didn't give it to you as a gift, don't covet it. Don't desire it. Don't covet pretty ladies. Don't covet status symbols like trucks or businesses, vacations, or cars. If it's not something that's yours to own, don't dwell on it. Don't desire it. Don't covet it. That's not how God says it, is it? Why? Why doesn't he say it that way? Coveting, big time, breaks the first and greatest commandment according to Jesus. And we've seen that. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. But the second commandment is like it in this way. You shall love your neighbor just as much as you love yourself. You should concern yourself with your neighbor just as much as you're concerned with you. Just think about it. As long as you're more interested in getting what your neighbor's got, you see your neighbor, you see he's got that, whatever it is, as long as you're more interested in getting for yourself what your neighbor's got, you're really not all that lovingly concerned about your neighbor, are you? Let alone as concerned for him or her as you are for yourself, right? Has it ever occurred to you that wanting that thing or that relationship or that experience that belongs to someone else is really a totally contemptful and unloving sin against them? You ever thought about that? Now, honestly, if that statement doesn't seem to fit your experiences, if that seems like a little bit of an overreach, like just because I want the thing that I see that he or she has, that doesn't mean that I'm full of contempt for them. Maybe that seems to you like a little bit of an overreach, my saying that. In that case, try to perceive coveting as a seed, okay? A seed of contempt, a seed of envy, a seed of jealousy. And once full grown, it's a seed that becomes expressed in unloving and covetous desires that do nothing but bring disaster upon your relationship with your neighbor because of you, because of coveting, because of envy. Next time we come back into this study, about 2 weeks from now, we're going to go back on tour at the BPT. You guys remember from this spring, the Bible Precedent Tour? And we're going to begin to look at examples throughout the Bible of the sort of thing these commandments are talking about. We're going to examine real life stories, real people in their stories, and perhaps come to realize that we're really not all that different from them in those stories as we live out our lives every day, right? I pray that when we look at those stories, that we'd see for ourselves as we face them, as we face these stories about sinful rebellion against God's law and the characters we're shown throughout the Bible, I pray that we'll identify with their stories, that we'll come to understand that looks like me, that we're sinners. I'm a sinner according to our very nature, and we're enslaved to that nature and are therefore children of wrath and damned to the pit of hell forever according to the holy law of God. And from there, if we come to believe that, should we find ourselves convicted of this by the Holy Spirit in our heart, we'd turn to Jesus Christ. That we'd find forgiveness having been raised to spiritual life in him and having died to our old selves in Christ. That we'd find that we are being conformed to his very likeness, being washed by Jesus Christ on the inside and seeing his nature that he gives us work its way out in our lives as we follow him, walking on righteous paths with clean feet. Now that'd be a miracle. It really would, but that's my goal. So let me close tonight with a story for you to think about to help set up the things you guys are going to talk about in your group time. And the original author of this story is unknown, and it's not a story from the Bible. We're going to get into that next time on the BPT. But as we close, let this vivid story illustrate the true contrast between love for your neighbor versus a desire for what your neighbor has. In a tall hospital building in some city somewhere, an old man lay dying by his window. He had friends half the time as his room was divided in two by a thin, smelly curtain. On account of his neighbor, that was something he savored, as he was friendly, and he had a talent. He had a great joy for bringing great joy to the last days of his hospice room neighbor. Yes, these rooms were the rooms for those at their end, for the aged who'd never recover. They're there till their end and will never again leave this room or even their bed. And in this hospital wing, he found it the thing that his neighbors expired before him. His new neighbor once said, "I see by the light that you have a window over there by your bed. Just like you, I'll never be rid of the condition I'm in. So if you tell me, friend, how's the view?" Oh my, what a sky. In the park below, there's all kinds of people always on the go. A man and wife with their pet. There were my wife and I met with balloons and a bouquet of roses. The new neighbor was great, even staying up late, swapping stories, becoming fast friends. But overnight the man coughed. By the window he coughed, desperately gasping for breath. He couldn't reach his button, the nurse's call button, so the new neighbor buzzed her with his. And the overnight nurses, with their life-saving purses, saved the life of the man by the window. "Thank you. This old thumb, you couldn't manage the button." "It's not time yet for you, friend. You're welcome." As his old breakfast tray was carried away, the new neighbor said, "Good morning. Like you, I'll never be rid of the condition I'm in, so if you tell me, friend, how's the view?" "Hi, neighbor guy. A parade's going by, and a boat in the river that's sailing. You wouldn't believe all the joy that I'm seeing in a world you and I, friend, are leaving." You can see all those things through that window? The whole world that we know is just down below. I'll gladly portray all it's showing. And with tears in his eyes, the new neighbor replies, "Man by the window, tell more. If I could only, new neighbor, tell you what the creator of the city below us created, and how the sun sets beneath the pinkest of seas, and fire of orange sky colors burning. There's more to see here in the city lights glare, and the youth of the nightlife abounding. Sleep well, my friend, there's more to come when we wake up and share a new morning." But in the night, once again, the man coughed and gasped, never finding his button. I could save him again, the life of my friend. For if I should lose him, what then? What then indeed? If he died, he'd leave that bed by the window to me. The night nurse didn't come, alarms never rung, and the man by the window didn't make it. Please, nurse, let me be by the window and see all the world that I'll soon be leaving. That's fair, said the nurse, but you're better off there, though if you insist on being moved, I don't care. Oh, the green of the park, and the city at dark, and the sunset and riverboats sailing. The people out where I too met my wife there at the corner of the city bank building. So I'll live out my days and at least set my gaze on the world that I'll soon be leaving. And with all his might, with great pain and with fright, eventually propped up on his elbow. At last he would see all his neighbor could see, the man who had died by the window. And the new neighbor saw all out of that window with awe. All his friend ever faced was a wall. Shall love your neighbor, not their stuff, not their relationships, not their situations. Shall love your neighbor just as you love yourself. Shall not covet your neighbor's house, shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. You foolish old man, in your last days I gave you a friend and a neighbor. And you rid yourself of a precious friend full of love, only to have what he had, which is nothing. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. You shall not covet.